The morning started like every other Thursday I had lived through in that building. I arrived early, unlocked my office, and placed my coffee beside my keyboard while the lights flickered to life. Nothing in the air suggested that the next hour would rip my professional life apart. I reviewed my tasks, checked the status of the pending reports, and reminded myself to follow up with clients who had been waiting for updates ever since the VP's nephew had been assigned as project coordinator. I had learned to manage chaos, but I had not expected that chaos would be the thing used to destroy me. Around 9, my computer chimed with a meeting invitation from HR. The subject line carried no explanation, only a time and a room number. The simplicity of it unsettled me in a way I could not describe. I stood, smoothed my shirt, and told myself it was probably routine documentation. The hallway felt unusually quiet as I walked toward the HR wing. Colleagues who usually greeted me looked away quickly. One pretended to study a document so intensely that it was almost comical. Another shifted in her seat as if she wanted to say something but chose silence instead. It was the kind of silence that belongs to people who already know something you do not. When I reached the HR door, my stomach felt heavy. I pushed it open and entered a room that seemed colder than it should have been. The VP sat at the far end of the table, legs crossed, fingers calmly tapping the folder in front of him. His nephew was nowhere in sight, which made the whole setup feel even more calculated. 2 HR representatives sat beside him, neither willing to meet my eyes. I took a seat, waiting for someone to speak. Finally, the VP opened the folder and slid a printed complaint toward me. My name was written at the top in bold letters. He said the accusation was serious and that I had verbally attacked his nephew during a project briefing the day before. I stared at the document, recognizing the meeting it referenced. The nephew had shown up unprepared, mixed up the timelines, and blamed me for the errors he had introduced. I had corrected him calmly in front of the team, nothing more. Apparently, that correction had now been rewritten into an incident worthy of immediate dismissal. I looked at the HR staff, hoping for some sign of fairness, but both avoided my gaze. Their body language revealed discomfort. One clutched a pen so tightly the cap bent. The other kept rearranging a stack of papers that did not need rearranging. They knew. For the first time, I sensed how deep the problem ran. The VP went on, explaining that the company had zero tolerance for workplace hostility. Every word he spoke carried the same rehearsed tone. He pretended disappointment, as if this was a tragedy for him personally. Not once did he ask for my version of events. He never mentioned the nephew's repeated mistakes or the countless hours I had spent correcting his work to keep clients from walking away. I tried to speak, but he raised his hand and said the decision had been finalized. Effective immediately. The job I had poured years into was taken away with the coldness of a signature. I felt a surge of disbelief rise through my chest. It was not anger at first, only shock, the kind that freezes your thoughts and makes the room feel distant. I asked for clarification, but HR insisted that any explanation I offered would not change the outcome. They were simply carrying out their duty. The VP leaned back, watching me with the calm of someone who believed he had complete control. At that moment, I understood that this had nothing to do with a complaint. This was a maneuver, a coordinated removal, and his nephew was at the center of it. When they handed me the termination documents, I felt an unexpected numbness settle over me. The room blurred at the edges. I had never been written up, never been involved in conflict, never failed a single performance review. Yet here I was, being escorted to my office to collect my belongings as if I were a threat to the building. As we walked back through the hallway, I saw heads turn. Some coworkers whispered, others pretended to work, but every glance carried curiosity mixed with fear. They were watching the fate that could easily become theirs. The escort did not speak, simply walked beside me as if silence would make the moment gentler. When we reached my office, I opened a cardboard box and began placing my things inside. My framed certificates, my notebooks filled with months of planning, the coffee mug from my daughter, the pen set I received for 10 years of service. Everything looked smaller under the weight of humiliation. I remembered the projects I had led, the teams I had trained, the overtime hours I had given without being asked. None of it mattered now. Reputation is fragile in corporate environments, and today, mine had been shattered by a single lie protected by a powerful man. As I finished packing, my colleague Mark approached the doorway. He hesitated before stepping closer. His eyes flickered with something between apology and fear. He whispered that he had heard the nephew brag about connections more times than he could count. He said he was sorry, but that he could not get involved. His voice trembled with guilt. Then he walked away quickly, afraid his presence might be noticed. His words confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This was planned. It was not an impulsive decision. It was a cleanup operation designed to protect someone who was unqualified and reckless. Carrying the box out of the building felt like walking through a tunnel where every step echoed the end of a chapter one had not agreed to close. The security guard opened the door slowly, giving me a sympathetic nod. Outside, the air felt heavier than the box I was holding. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the building where I had built my identity for so long. Losing a job at 35 or 40 is not the same as losing it at 20. The stakes are higher, the responsibilities heavier, the fear sharper. That morning, I did not know that the humiliation I felt was the beginning of something far bigger. I did not know the truth I would soon uncover. I only knew that my career had collapsed without warning, and the silence of those who watched felt just as painful as the injustice itself. The first morning after my termination felt unreal. I woke up at the usual hour, expecting the familiar rhythm of my routine to pull me into motion, but the house felt different. It was strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves sensed that something had shifted. For the first time in years, there was no urgency. No deadlines waiting on my laptop. No client emails collecting in my inbox. No meeting reminders vibrating on my phone. Instead, there was a stillness that felt heavy and uncomfortable. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight creeping through the curtains, unsure of what to do next. Losing a job in your late 30s or early 40s is not just about income. It is about identity, purpose, and the stability that anchors entire families. I felt all of that slipping through my fingers. At breakfast, my partner placed a hand on mine and told me to breathe, reminding me that people lose jobs every day. They insisted that taking the high road would keep my dignity intact and that reacting too strongly could make things worse. I nodded, but their words felt distant. They had not been in that room. They had not seen the smug confidence on the nephew's face as he silently enjoyed the power he held over my reputation. They had not heard the VP's controlled tone as he delivered the decision without hesitation. I tried to focus on my partner's reassurance, but my mind kept drifting back to that meeting, replaying every detail with painful clarity. By afternoon, the reality began to settle. My inbox was filled with automated alerts from LinkedIn. People were viewing my profile, and some had even endorsed me for skills I had not used in months. When I clicked on my own page, I saw why the sudden activity felt so unnerving. Someone had updated my profile summary to reflect that I was open to work due to an internal conflict. The phrasing was carefully crafted to sound neutral, yet it carried just enough ambiguity to spark suspicion. I felt a slow burn of anger rise in my chest. Companies rarely handle exits quietly. Rumors spread faster than official announcements, and those who want to climb higher often participate willingly. I tried calling a former colleague, but the conversation lasted barely 2 minutes. Their voice sounded nervous, and they quickly shifted topics before excusing themselves with a vague promise to talk later. Another coworker texted a short message telling me to stay strong, followed by a request not to mention they had reached out. That fear confirmed what I already sensed. The environment I had left behind was tightening around the VP's authority, and no one wanted to be associated with someone he had pushed out. Watching that culture swallow people who once prided themselves on integrity left a bitter taste in my mouth. The second day did not feel any easier. Friends called to offer advice, but most of it sounded like scripted lines from self-help books. One encouraged me to take a break and enjoy the sudden free time. Another said the job had never appreciated me. A third suggested I start consulting. They all meant well, but none of them understood the private shame that settles in your chest when you lose a job under false accusations. Losing employment is difficult. Being falsely labeled difficult or unprofessional adds another layer that bruises the ego and the spirit. My family tried to be supportive, but their questions carried a pressure I was not ready to handle. My mother asked repeatedly if I had raised my voice at the nephew. My brother wanted to know if I had plans to sue the company. My sister suggested networking events and online courses. Every question reminded me that I was no longer in control, and every attempted reassurance felt like a reminder that something fundamental had broken. I smiled through the conversations, but each call left me more exhausted than the last. That night, I lay awake replaying the moment the HR representative stared at the table instead of looking at me. I remembered the VP's calm, rehearsed voice as he claimed to value a healthy work environment. I heard again the silent satisfaction of his nephew's absence, as if avoiding eye contact would cleanse him of guilt. The more I replayed it, the clearer the truth became. That meeting was not an isolated event. It was the final step in a sequence I had not noticed unfolding. On the third day, I received a message that changed everything. It came from a former coworker I barely spoke to. The message was short and cautious. They told me that my dismissal was not surprising and that the nephew had caused issues long before I arrived. They explained that another employee had tried to file a complaint about his behavior the previous year, but had been reassigned quietly. According to them, the VP had intervened multiple times to protect his nephew from consequences. The details were vague, but the implication was unmistakable. My termination was not about performance. It was part of a long-standing pattern. Reading that message sent a cold wave through my body. Suddenly, the pieces aligned. The altered reports. The missing approvals. The last-minute changes blamed on me. They had not been coincidences. They were deliberate steps in a strategy meant to secure the nephew's rise while removing anyone who could expose his incompetence. I sat back in my chair, feeling both validated and horrified. Validation came from realizing I had not imagined the manipulation. Horror came from recognizing how far the VP had been willing to go. The next few days followed a rhythm of silence and sleepless nights. I tried applying for jobs, but writing cover letters felt like forcing words onto an identity I no longer recognized. Every time I attempted to describe my experience, I hesitated, unsure of how much truth to reveal. Should I mention the unfair termination? Should I keep it vague? Would honesty cost me new opportunities? The uncertainty weighed on me, and the strain made it difficult to breathe. At night, I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house. The ceiling felt closer than usual, as if the space itself echoed the pressure building inside me. I thought about bills, obligations, and the stability I had worked so hard to maintain. I thought about the years spent building a reputation that could now be dismissed with a single false report. The responsibility felt crushing. Losing a job is not only about losing income. It is about losing the structure that holds a life together. Despite the fear, a small spark kept flickering inside me. The message from the former coworker was more than gossip. It was a hint of something bigger, something hidden. The VP's actions were not simple favoritism. They were a pattern, and patterns leave trails. As the nights grew longer and sleep more distant, that spark began to grow. My humiliation began to transform into quiet determination. Shame turned into curiosity. Fear turned into resolve. The days after my termination were marked by silence, shame, and sleepless nights, but they also planted the seed for something I had not expected. A willingness to look deeper. A drive to uncover what really happened behind those office walls. I did not know it then, but those painful days were the beginning of a truth that would shake the company far more than my dismissal ever had. 3 days after losing my job, I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, trying to convince myself to apply for yet another position that did not match my experience, when an email notification appeared in the corner of the screen. At first, I thought it was spam. The subject line looked like a cluster of internal codes and dates, the kind that only makes sense inside a specific company system. My heart tightened a little when I saw the sender. It was from one of the finance team members at my former job. The email had been sent to me by mistake. The first line said that the report attached was ready for the VP to review and that the nephew's training funds had been successfully redirected into the revised project budget. The message ended with a request to finalize the nephew's new position as project lead. My name was nowhere in the conversation, which only made it clearer that I was never supposed to see it. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. The name of the project mentioned was one I had managed for months. It had a detailed budget I knew almost by heart. I felt a sharp chill when I opened the attachment. The updated numbers did not match anything I remembered. Whole sections of the budget had been reallocated. The funds that had once been dedicated to client support were now listed under conference fees and leadership development programs. I recognized the dates. They matched the nephew's recent trip, the one he had described as a conference essential to his growth. No one had mentioned that the money came straight out of a budget I had once been responsible for protecting. My hands tightened over the keyboard as I scrolled through the document. The nephew was listed as project lead effective immediately. The justification sections claimed he had been involved in strategy planning for months, which was a complete fabrication. He had barely shown up to half the meetings and spent more time in the break room than at his desk. Yet here he was being credited with responsibilities I had carried entirely on my own. It felt like reading a rewritten version of history where my work never existed. The deeper I went into the document, the more conflicted I felt. Shock mixed with anger, and anger mixed with something far heavier. Betrayal. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Everything began to replay in my mind, but this time with new clarity. The nephew's consistent confusion during briefings. His habit of arriving late. The way he deflected blame with that practiced, innocent expression. I had brushed it off as laziness and youthful arrogance. I never imagined it was part of a carefully crafted ascent. The VP had not just shielded him. He had carried him, and he had used people like me to clear the path. I opened my notebook from work, the one I had grabbed in my rush out of the building. It was filled with scribbles, reminders, and meeting notes. I flipped through the pages searching for details to compare with the email. It did not take long to find my first confirmation of manipulation. A budget change from 2 months earlier that had never made sense now aligned perfectly with the shifts shown in the new report. At the time, I had assumed it was simply a routine adjustment. I had never considered that someone was quietly pulling resources from my project to support the nephew's personal development. Each page I turned revealed moments I had dismissed as administrative quirks. Now they looked like red flags I had been too focused or too trusting to see. It is a strange sensation to realize that the work you thought you controlled had been altered behind your back. The numbers and schedules I managed with precision had been reshaped by someone who saw them as tools for personal advancement rather than responsibilities to uphold. I kept flipping through the notebook until I reached a page from a meeting that had taken place just 2 weeks before my termination. In the margin, I had written a brief note about a missing invoice. I remembered asking about it and being told the delay was due to a change in vendor policy. Looking at that note now, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. That invoice was likely tied to another of the nephew's budget diversions. The pattern was no longer a coincidence. It was a strategy. The more I examined my own notes, the clearer the scheme became. Budgets had been altered. Responsibilities had been reassigned. Reports had been edited to shift blame or inflate accomplishments. My termination was not the unfortunate consequence of a misunderstanding. It was the removal of an obstacle. I had been working in a system that rewarded silence and punished integrity. I had not realized it because I had been too focused on doing my job. People like the nephew move quietly, but the damage they create leaves deep trails once you begin searching for them. Just when I thought I had uncovered enough to understand the shape of the truth, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a former colleague, someone I had known for years, but had never seen cross any ethical lines. They said they had heard about my termination and wanted to clarify something that had always bothered them. The nephew had once bragged openly that nothing could touch him because the VP owed him more than anyone would ever know. At first, they thought it was youthful bravado, the kind of nonsense privileged employees say to inflate their importance. But as time went on, they began noticing how protected he was. Mistakes vanished from project logs. Complaints were dismissed before being documented. Opportunities appeared out of nowhere. When they saw what had happened to me, they realized the brag was not a joke. It was a confession in disguise. Reading that message made my pulse race. Suddenly, the email I received by accident no longer felt like a simple mistake. It felt like a crack in the wall, a glimpse through the surface of a system built on manipulation and nepotism. The VP had not protected his nephew out of love or loyalty. It was a calculated investment. The nephew was his pet project, crafted to rise quickly, shielded from consequences, and insulated from accountability. The email had exposed the financial side of the scheme. The message from my colleague had revealed the cultural side. Together they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. I reread the email, the numbers, the lines that had been redesigned to accommodate the nephew's rise. I reread my notes, seeing them now with new eyes. Every discrepancy pointed to the same truth. My termination had been orchestrated long before I had even noticed the warning signs. The nephew needed my position, and the VP needed a justification to eliminate me. The accusation they used was a mask. The real reason was power. Sitting there in the quiet of my dining room, surrounded by notebooks, printed reports, and the glow of my laptop, I felt something shift inside me. The days of shock and shame were slowly transforming into something sharper. A sense of clarity. A sense of purpose. For the first time since that humiliating walk out of the office, I felt a spark of control return. What I held in my hands was not just evidence of corruption. It was the first clue. The beginning of a trail that could expose everything. I closed the laptop and pressed my palm against its lid, letting the weight of the discovery settle. The VP thought he had ended my career. He had no idea he had just given me the first piece of the truth that would unravel his entire scheme. The morning after receiving the accidental email, I sat at my desk with a calm I had not felt since the day I was fired. It was not the calm of peace, but the calm that comes when you finally understand the shape of the storm you are walking into. I told myself that if I wanted the truth, I had to approach this like a professional, not a wounded ex-employee seeking revenge. I needed to be precise, organized, and patient. I opened a fresh folder on my laptop, titled it cautiously, and began building the first pieces of my investigation. There was no anger driving me anymore, only clarity. The kind of clarity that settles into a person after sleepless nights and painful realizations. The first thing I did was retrieve every file I had backed up during my time at the company. Like many employees who manage heavy projects, I kept copies of meeting notes, budget outlines, and client communications. I had never imagined those documents would become my shield one day. I began combing through them with renewed purpose, cross-checking dates, approvals, and altered versions of reports. It took hours, but slowly a timeline began to form. The nephew's name appeared repeatedly in places it did not belong. Approvals stamped with his initials showed up long before he had authority to sign anything. Expenses tagged as training or development aligned perfectly with trips he had taken. I felt my pulse steady each time a piece fell into place. After organizing the internal documents, I turned to my email archives. I searched for old conversations with clients who had complained about delayed deliverables months before my termination. At the time, I had taken responsibility because it was my role, even though I knew the delays were caused by the nephew's carelessness. Now those emails carried a different significance. They gave me a chance to prove a pattern. I drafted polite messages to those clients, phrasing my questions carefully and respectfully. I explained that I was reviewing past project processes for my own records and wanted to clarify the timelines and quality issues that had occurred during certain phases. I expected most of them to ignore me. Instead, 3 responded within a day. Their confirmations came cautiously, but they came. One client explained that the reports they had received had been incomplete and rushed long before I ever managed the project. Another mentioned several instances where meetings were rescheduled because internal approvals were not ready. A third confessed that they had complained to the company more than once, but were told the delays were due to unexpected internal restructuring. Each message felt like a small weight being lifted off my shoulders. Not because it made me feel better, but because it exposed the truth I had been blamed for. These clients, without knowing it, helped construct a narrative that contradicted the one the company had used against me. Still, I knew that client accounts alone were not enough. I needed information from someone who understood how the company operated behind closed doors. Someone who had seen what employees were never supposed to see. That was when I remembered a retired HR employee who had left a year earlier. We had spoken occasionally during my time at the company, enough for me to believe she had retained a sense of fairness that many others had lost. I hesitated before reaching out. I did not want to put her in a difficult position. But after a long moment, I typed a brief message asking if she would be open to a conversation. To my surprise, she responded within an hour and agreed to speak privately the next morning. When she called, her voice carried the steady tone of someone who had lived enough life to recognize injustice without needing dramatic retellings. I explained everything that had happened, from the false accusation to the email I had received by mistake. She listened carefully, occasionally sighing as though none of it surprised her. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line before she finally spoke. She told me the company had a long history of protecting the VP's family members. She said complaints against them were routinely redirected, buried, or reframed as misunderstandings. She explained that upper management had created an internal culture where the VP's decisions were rarely questioned. Anyone who tried was either transferred, sidelined, or quietly pushed out. She did not sound bitter as she explained this. She sounded tired. Tired of seeing the same patterns repeat year after year. Her words confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. I thanked her for her honesty, and she told me to protect myself carefully. She reminded me that companies like this survived by intimidating people into silence. When the call ended, I sat with her words echoing in my mind. The company did not want justice. It wanted obedience. And I had refused to remain quiet at the moment it mattered most. With the client confirmations, the internal documents, and the retired HR employee's insight, I returned to my laptop with renewed focus. I began organizing everything into a structured case. I created folders for budgets, timelines, responsibilities, and altered approvals. I labeled every item carefully and wrote summaries for each category. I highlighted inconsistencies in the nephew's documented progress. I compared his supposed involvement with my actual notes from the same periods. The gaps were unmistakable. As I arranged the evidence, the tension inside me shifted. It no longer felt like anxiety. It felt like responsibility. A quiet, clear responsibility to reveal the truth not out of spite, but out of principle. I reminded myself repeatedly to stay calm and rational. This was not about attacking anyone. It was about documenting facts that had been buried under layers of privilege and manipulation. Hours passed as I assembled the case piece by piece. Every document felt like a brick building a structure I had never imagined constructing. I approached it the same way I approached major projects at the company. With precision, with care, with maturity. My goal was never to create drama. My goal was to present the truth so cleanly that no one could dismiss it as bitterness or revenge. By evening, the folder had grown into a detailed record of everything I had found. Every discrepancy was supported. Every number was cross-checked. Every claim was documented. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity as I reviewed the final structure. I had walked into this investigation unsure of what I would find, but what I uncovered was undeniable. The truth was finally taking shape. And for the first time since my dismissal, I felt grounded. Not because the situation had improved, but because I was no longer lost in confusion and humiliation. I knew exactly what I was facing, and I knew exactly how meticulously I needed to move forward. The investigation had begun quietly, but the truth it was revealing was anything but small. It was growing, expanding, becoming impossible to ignore. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the screen fade into darkness. Whatever came next, I was ready. Because I finally understood that uncovering corruption is not dramatic. It is patient, careful work. And I had just taken my first real steps toward exposing everything they hoped I would never find. The following morning, I sat in front of my laptop with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a determination that felt heavier than anything I had carried during my years at the company. The documents I had gathered were enough to raise suspicion, but suspicion alone would not expose a system that had operated comfortably in the shadows for years. I needed something that could not be dismissed or explained away. Something solid. Something undeniable. I opened my folders again, scanning lines of data until one particular expense report caught my eye. It had been approved under the Label Leadership Development Retreat. The amount exceeded anything an ordinary training session would require. It was a 5-figure sum that had never been discussed in any of the budgeting meetings I had attended. The approval carried the VP's digital signature. I clicked the attached invoice and felt a slow, cold realization spread through me. The hotel name on the invoice was not a conference center. It was a luxury resort located far outside the city. I double-checked the dates and the purpose listed. It described the trip as a leadership conference for rising project leads. The nephew was the only attendee. The itinerary included spa services, private transportation, and a beachfront suite. Not a single entry suggested an actual conference had taken place. I stared at the invoice for a long moment, feeling my breath grow shallow. This was no training trip. This was personal indulgence funded by redirected project money, the same money that had caused our timelines to tighten and force unrealistic expectations on the team. I opened another document to cross-check the dates. My hands shook slightly as I matched the travel schedule with a major project failure that had taken place during that same period. It was the moment everything had collapsed and the moment I had been blamed for lack of oversight. I remembered the endless calls from clients, the late nights spent trying to salvage what was left, the confusion over missing approvals. But there was something else I remembered clearly. During that entire crisis, the nephew claimed he had overseen essential tasks and was present for every milestone. The documents now showed that he had been out of the country at the time, enjoying a private trip disguised as professional development. While I had carried the weight of the failure and been pushed to take responsibility for delays, the real cause had been sipping drinks beside a pool. I opened the project timeline I had kept in my notes. The milestone that triggered the failure had required the nephew's approval. His signature appeared on it, yet the timestamp indicated it had been approved at a time when his flight itinerary placed him thousands of miles away. My mind pieced the picture together quickly. The signature had either been predated or forged through an internal system that allowed someone with administrative access to alter timestamps. Either way, the evidence was now clear. He had not been present. He had not led anything. He had been lying while I had been accused of negligence. I leaned forward and opened another folder, this one containing the emails I had recovered from my backups. If the nephew was out of the country, there should be a pattern in his communications. A rhythm that did not match his supposed involvement. I sorted the emails by date and began scanning them. The pattern was impossible to miss. For nearly a week during the project failure, he had responded with short messages sent at odd hours, as if he had been traveling or distracted. None of the emails referenced the ongoing crisis. None addressed the issues clients were raising. Yet on internal logs, he was listed as having taken key actions and addressed important decisions. Those entries now looked like the footprints of someone trying to cover their absence after the fact. I clicked on an email chain that included a forwarded confirmation from the resort. It detailed his room preferences, arrival time, and even special requests. The timestamp on the confirmation overlapped perfectly with a meeting he supposedly led that week. The confirmation had been forwarded to his personal email, and from there, it had been forwarded again to the VP's assistant. The assistant had marked it as confidential. There was no logical reason for that unless they all understood what the trip truly was. I took a screenshot immediately and saved it in a separate folder labeled Core Evidence. The next step was verifying whether the leadership conference had ever existed. I searched for public listings of the event. After a few attempts, the truth became clear. There was no conference scheduled at the resort or anywhere near it during those dates. The event name listed on the invoice did not exist. It was a fabricated justification used to move company funds into a personal getaway. My heart pounded as the final piece fell into place. The VP had approved a 5-figure personal vacation for his nephew, then shifted the financial strain onto my project and blamed me for the fallout. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the discovery settle. It was not rage that filled me. It was a deep, steady clarity. Facts do not shout. They do not exaggerate. They simply stand in the light once uncovered. And what I had now were facts. Simple, unavoidable, documented facts. I opened a spreadsheet and began listing everything in chronological order. The trip dates, the false milestone approvals, the fabricated conference, the redirected funds, the client complaints, the nephew's absence, the blaming of my performance. Every line added a new dimension to the picture forming in front of me. A picture of corruption that had been carefully hidden under layers of administrative noise. By the time I finished, the spreadsheet looked like a map of a crime scene. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Only factual. As I reviewed the final structure, another thought crossed my mind. I had encountered an IT technician once who mentioned that administrative access logs were stored externally for compliance reasons. If I could obtain even one of those logs, it might prove that timestamps were manipulated. I sent a respectful message to a former IT contact, someone who had always valued fairness more than office politics. Their reply came late that evening. They confirmed that the logs existed and that some had been archived around the time of the project failure. They hesitated to send anything directly, but they provided enough detail to guide my search. I thanked them and returned to my files. The evidence was no longer fragments. It was a complete structure. A structure that showed exactly how the nephew had risen. Exactly how the VP had protected him. Exactly how I had become collateral damage in a system designed to reward incompetence wrapped in privilege. When I leaned back in my chair, the room felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. I had crossed a point of no return. The breakthrough I had found was not something that could be ignored. Not by me, and certainly not by the company. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented reality waiting to be revealed. The morning I decided to send my findings to the board of directors felt strangely peaceful. I woke before dawn, long before the neighborhood stirred, and sat at the dining table where the last few weeks of notes and files lay neatly organized. Everything I had gathered felt heavy, but it also felt precise. There was no emotion inside those folders, no anger or bitterness woven between the pages. It was all numbers, dates, approvals, receipts, screenshots, and silence. The kind of silence that only facts can carry. I took a slow breath, opened a blank email, and began writing the most important message of my career. My tone was calm, professional, and respectful. I did not accuse anyone. I did not dramatize. I simply stated that I had been terminated under circumstances that did not reflect the truth and that I wished to submit documentation that revealed serious inconsistencies affecting company integrity. I attached everything. The invoices for the nephew's luxury trip disguised as a conference. The budget diversions approved without oversight. The timestamps showing he had signed documents while out of the country. The emails demonstrating delays that predated my involvement. The statements from former clients. The notes revealing manipulated reports. I reviewed the folder once more, making sure nothing was out of place. Then, with a steady hand, I clicked send. It was not a triumphant moment. It was quiet, almost solemn, like placing a sealed envelope on a table and walking away without looking back. By noon, I received my first response. A short acknowledgement from a board assistant thanking me for my submission and confirming that the files had been forwarded to the appropriate internal panel. No promises. No sympathy. Only procedure. And yet, I felt a shift in the air, as though the ground under the company was no longer as stable as it once appeared. I closed my laptop and let the day move on without expectation. The next morning, my phone buzzed repeatedly. The board had called for an internal audit. It began quietly, almost invisibly, but inside the company, it was felt immediately. A former colleague messaged me early, her words rushed and overflowing with worry. She said managers were whispering in corners, department heads were pulling old reports for review, and the VP had summoned his assistant twice in the same hour. She did not know exactly what had triggered the sudden storm, but she suspected it involved me. There was no satisfaction in her message, only the cautious relief of someone who had watched injustice unfold for too long. Around midday, another message arrived, this one from someone who had not spoken to me since the morning I packed my box and walked out. They apologized for staying silent during my termination. They admitted they knew something felt wrong, but were afraid to speak against the VP's influence. I did not hold their silence against them. People protect their families, their mortgages, their stability. Companies know this. Those in power exploit it. I thanked them politely and wished them well. As the day progressed, more messages came. Some from former teammates who had once avoided eye contact in the hallway. Some from colleagues who had believed the false narrative about me until the audit forced them to reconsider. All expressed variations of the same thought. They were sorry. They had known something was wrong. They had not expected the truth to unravel so quickly. Reading their words felt surreal. I remembered their faces the day I was escorted out of the building, their uncertainty, their fear of being associated with someone marked as difficult. Now, with the audit digging into every corner, their silence had become confession. While employees talked quietly among themselves, panic spread through the ranks of those who had benefited from the VP's influence. The nephew, who once carried himself with the confidence of someone untouchable, began acting erratically. One colleague told me he spent an entire afternoon deleting old emails from shared drives, unaware that the company's servers archived every message long before it reached his inbox. His attempts to erase his tracks were futile, yet he still rushed from office to office, asking managers for copies of documents he claimed were misplaced. His behavior was no longer arrogant. It was frightened. The VP reacted differently. He maintained an appearance of authority, walking the halls as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, cracks formed. He called impromptu meetings, urging employees to remember the importance of unity and discretion. He reminded managers that loyalty was the foundation of professionalism. His words carried an edge that had not been there before. It was not leadership. It was intimidation disguised as reassurance. According to one source, he even visited HR and demanded to know who had reopened certain archived reports. His voice was calm, but his anger simmered beneath every syllable. Despite the chaos inside the company walls, I remained calm. I did not send additional messages. I did not defend myself publicly. I did not contact employees or attempt to influence the audit. Instead, I let the truth do the work. That had been my plan from the beginning. Facts carry their own weight. They do not need shouting. They do not need vengeance to sharpen them. They simply need to be allowed to stand. 3 days into the audit, the board requested clarification about a particular expense report. They asked how a training budget meant for project personnel had been used for a private resort stay. They asked why times. On the 7th day, a board member sent me a formal message acknowledging the accuracy of several findings in my submission. They informed me that the investigation was expanding and that further steps would be taken. The tone was restrained and professional, but beneath it I sensed something else. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Respect. I closed the message and leaned back in my chair. The house around me was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives only when a long storm has begun to break. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. The destruction of a corrupt system is not a victory parade. It is a slow, measured correction of something that should never have been allowed to grow. The company had fired the wrong person. And now, not because I shouted, not because I fought loudly, but because I stayed calm and let the truth stand, they finally understood exactly what they had done. The morning the audit findings became public within the company, I woke with a strange sense of anticipation. Something in the air felt different. Even before I checked my phone, I sensed that the silence which had weighed on me for weeks was finally beginning to crack open. When I opened my inbox, the first message waiting for me was from a board member. The subject line was brief, almost understated, but the implications were enormous. The internal audit had concluded its initial phase, and several anomalies had been formally confirmed. Misuse of company funds, fraudulent training expenses, altered performance reports, approvals granted under circumstances that violated internal policy. The tone of the message was clinical, but the weight behind the words was unmistakable. They had found everything. Within an hour, more messages followed. Word had spread inside the company faster than anyone expected. The audit team had uncovered a trail so clear that even those who had once defended the VP were left speechless. Screenshots of misallocated budgets were circulated through internal channels. Receipts from the nephew's luxury trip appeared in confidential summaries. Performance reports showed signs of deliberate manipulation, with metadata revealing edits made late at night from the VP's office. Employees who had once believed the narrative about me now found themselves staring at undeniable evidence of widespread corruption. One colleague, someone I had barely spoken to since my termination, sent a message confessing he had always suspected something was wrong but never imagined the scale. Another wrote that the HR department was in complete disarray, scrambling to explain why previous complaints involving the nephew had been dismissed without investigation. As I scrolled through the notifications, I felt a calm I had not experienced in months. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. The truth had finally stepped into the light. By midday, the company released its first internal announcement. It was formal, carefully worded, and clearly written by legal counsel. It stated that an internal review had revealed procedural violations linked to the VP's department. Pending further investigation, the VP was suspended. The nephew had been removed from all project responsibilities effective immediately. A team of external auditors would be appointed to continue the inquiry. Managers connected to the falsified reports were being questioned individually. The announcement did not mention my name, but its implications were clear to everyone who had watched my departure. Soon after the announcement circulated, messages began flooding in from employees who had once avoided me. Some wrote apologizing for their silence. Others congratulated me for bringing the truth forward. A few tried to sound supportive without acknowledging that they had once believed the lies. Their sudden warmth felt strange, almost hollow, yet I did not respond with bitterness. People often return when the tides shift. It is human nature to gravitate toward the side that appears to be rising. I answered politely, keeping my distance, acknowledging their words without letting them rewrite their past behavior. Later that afternoon, I received a formal letter attached to another email from the board. It acknowledged the company's mishandling of my termination and confirmed that the accusations made against me were based on falsified information. The tone of the letter was respectful. It apologized for the distress caused by a decision made without full review. It stated that the company regretted the harm done to my professional reputation. The message was simple but powerful. It recognized what I had known all along. I had been fired not for misconduct, but because I had been standing in the way of a scheme crafted by people who believed they were untouchable. The apology was not emotional. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of fact. And facts, when presented cleanly, carry their own form of justice. As more information spread, the internal collapse unfolded with remarkable speed. Employees who had long feared the VP's influence now found themselves speaking openly with the audit team. Some revealed past incidents involving the nephew that had been buried by HR. Others provided emails that showed how certain budgets were rerouted without proper approval. Managers who once dismissed complaints suddenly cooperated fully. The facade of power that the VP had worn for years dissolved in a matter of days. The nephew's fall was even more dramatic. One colleague shared that he had broken down during questioning, insisting he had only followed his uncle's instructions. He claimed he had never meant to cause harm. His words, however, carried little weight. The evidence showed he had benefited from every manipulated report, every hidden complaint, every missing receipt. His arrogance had vanished, replaced with desperation. He had spent months believing nothing could touch him. Now he found himself exposed, stripped of authority, and increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, the VP maintained a facade of calm. Even as he was escorted out of the building, he attempted to reassure employees that everything was a misunderstanding. But the whispers that followed him through the hall made it clear no one believed him anymore. His influence had dissolved the moment the truth emerged. Power built on fear collapses quickly when fear fades. The ripple effect of the audit extended outward. Several department heads were removed temporarily. HR leaders were questioned for their involvement in cover-ups. Internal communications were reviewed for signs of pressure or intimidation. Teams were restructured. Processes that had been ignored for years were suddenly enforced with strict precision. The company wanted to rebuild its credibility. But rebuilding starts only when broken pieces are acknowledged, not hidden. As the company struggled to regain stability, I watched from a distance with a mixture of relief and quiet reflection. The people who now reached out with warmth had once walked past me without a second thought. A few even attempted to position themselves as allies, praising my integrity or claiming they always believed something was off. I responded to them with kindness, but not with trust. Some apologies come from genuine regret. Others are attempts to align with the new reality. I had no desire to judge, only to move forward with clarity. A week later, I received a call from a senior board member. He spoke with a sincerity that felt rare in corporate settings. He thanked me for bringing the truth forward in a manner that was respectful and organized. He said the board had been unaware of the severity of the situation and that my documentation had been instrumental in exposing long-standing issues. He asked if I would consider returning in a senior advisory role once the restructuring was complete. His offer carried weight, but I did not answer immediately. I told him I needed time to think. He agreed without pressure. When the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room, letting the moment settle. The collapse of their scheme was not just a correction of wrongdoing. It marked the beginning of something larger. A transformation. Not only for the company, but for me. I had entered this ordeal feeling humiliated, powerless, and discarded. Now, without raising my voice, without bitterness, without revenge, I had shown that truth, when handled with patience and precision, can dismantle even the most protected structures. Their scheme had collapsed. My name had been restored. And something deeper had awakened inside me. A sense of strength that comes only when a person survives injustice and stands again, not broken, but sharper and wiser than before. When everything finally settled, I found myself standing at a strange crossroads. The company that once discarded me without hesitation was now extending polite invitations, offering meetings, presenting future opportunities as if nothing had happened. The apology letter sat neatly in a drawer, untouched since the day I received it. People who had once looked away in hallways now reached out with long messages filled with regret, encouragement, or subtle attempts to reconnect. Yet none of it stirred the emotions I once expected to feel. I did not want revenge. I did not crave validation. I did not need them to recognize my worth. What I wanted was something far simpler and far more meaningful. Peace. Clarity. A future that did not depend on fragile corporate loyalty. For the first time in my adult life, I realized that protecting my name mattered more than protecting anyone's comfort. Instead of rushing back into the company's chaos, I took a breath and decided to build something different. I spent several quiet weeks reflecting on what I wanted my life to look like beyond titles, meetings, and performance reviews. Losing that job, as humiliating as it had been, forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for years. I had tied my identity to a workplace that never truly protected me. I had given my loyalty to an institution that saw me as replaceable. And in doing so, I had forgotten that peace comes from self-respect, not approval. I considered the board's offer seriously, but every time I imagined walking through those halls again, something inside me tightened. Returning felt like stepping back into a shadow that no longer fit who I had become. So I declined politely, thanking them for their professionalism and wishing them well. Their response was respectful, but I could sense their surprise. People rarely walk away from security once they regain it. But I had learned that security built on fragile trust is not security at all. With a renewed sense of direction, I decided to start an independent consulting business. It was something I had considered years earlier, but never found the courage to pursue. Now the hesitation was gone. I used my severance savings sparingly, investing in a clean website, organizing my portfolio, and reaching out to clients who had valued my work long before the company turned against me. Many responded quickly, offering opportunities that felt genuine and rooted in respect rather than politics. They remembered the late nights, the consistent results, the professionalism I carried even under pressure. These were relationships built on merit, not manipulation. Building the business was slow at first, but it grew steadily. Each project reminded me that my skills were mine alone, not something the company had granted or taken away. I shaped my own hours, chose clients who matched my values, and worked with a clarity that came from not having to look over my shoulder. The absence of fear was transformative. I no longer worried about hidden agendas or someone else's ambition erasing my work. My name was mine again, and this time I protected it with intention. As the months passed, the experience changed the way I communicated with others, especially those over 35 who watched my story unfold and felt echoes of their own struggles in corporate environments. I began mentoring quietly, sharing the lessons I had learned with people who felt trapped in toxic workplaces. I told them something that had taken me years to understand. At a certain age, maturity is not measured by how well you stay silent. It is measured by how wisely you choose your battles. Sometimes harmony is not a sign of peace. It is a sign of fear. And fear is the quickest way to lose your voice. I explained that protecting your name is not about confrontation. It is about clarity. You do not need to shout to defend yourself. You do not need to match the noise of people who thrive on manipulation. You only need to gather your truth, organize it, and let it speak. Facts are quiet, but they cut through lies with a precision that anger never achieves. People over 35 understand this deeply. We have lived enough to know that dignity does not come from winning arguments. It comes from refusing to betray yourself. With time, my story spread beyond my small network. Friends told it. Colleagues retold it. People I had never met reached out to thank me for showing that calm resistance can be more powerful than loud fury. The irony was not lost on me. The same company that had once stripped me of my reputation had unintentionally given me a platform to help others reclaim theirs. The collapse of their scheme had become the beginning of my own transformation. One afternoon, months after the audit, I received a message from a young employee who still worked at my former company. She wrote that the culture had shifted drastically since the VP's suspension. People felt freer to speak. HR began reviewing old cases with seriousness instead of dismissal. Managers acted with newfound accountability. She said my case had become an internal reminder that silence protects corruption and that truth, when handled with composure, protects everyone else. I read her message twice before responding with a simple thank you. Knowing that the truth helped someone else meant more to me than any formal apology ever could. As my business grew, I noticed something else changing in my life. I no longer carried the weight of trying to prove myself. I no longer felt the urge to keep the peace at the cost of my sanity. I no longer allowed others to dictate the value of my work. This new sense of grounding brought a calmness that was deeply mature. The kind of calmness that only people over 35 truly understand. The calmness that comes from experience, resilience, and the wisdom to walk away when necessary. The biggest lesson I carried was simple yet profound. Sometimes defending yourself costs everything. Your job, your reputation, your comfort. But losing everything is often the only way the truth becomes visible. The collapse of your old life forces you to rebuild a new one, and that new life is often stronger because it is rooted in clarity rather than fear. As I moved forward, I realized that the ordeal had not broken me. It had refined me. It had sharpened my instincts, strengthened my boundaries, and taught me that silence is not always a virtue. Harmony is not always peace. Loyalty is not always wisdom. And comfort is not always worth the price of your integrity. In the end, protecting my name taught me something no job ever could. Peace does not come from being liked. It comes from standing tall in your truth, even when it costs you everything. And when the truth finally emerges, it rebuilds your life on a foundation far stronger than the one that fell apart. My story ended with dignity, clarity, and a future I chose for myself. And for anyone over 35, that is the real lesson. Protect your name. Do not protect their comfort. Because the moment you choose yourself, the world around you begins to change.